Welcome, everyone. We are very pleased to relaunch the Teachers Against Climate Crisis series, and this time in a wonderful collaboration with the Global Tapestry of Alternatives and with Kalpavriksh. So just a brief introduction to Teachers Against Climate Crisis. We are a network of mostly India-based, but also worldwide educators. And we are very, very much interested in looking at the different dimensions of climate change where it addresses education, whether it's formal education or informal education. We are non-aligned, not affiliated with any political party or any such thing. And we are a large and diverse group. So today, what we are going to do is to have a talk by Ashish Kothari and Shrishtee Bajpai. And this talk is on earthy governance and interspecies justice. And I just want to point out that one of the things that we do at TACC is to really examine the roots of our crisis and not just look at surface solutions and surface approaches, but to really try to question that, excuse me, a crisis that is challenging all our frameworks demands that we examine the very basis of those frameworks, that we question things we don't normally question. And so today's talk is in that spirit, where we are truly taking a deep look at our relationship with the non-human. And so I'm going to just briefly introduce our speakers. So we have Shrishtee Bajpai. Shrishtee is a writer, researcher, and activist working at the intersection of environmental justice, more than human governance, worldviews, and systemic transformations. She's part of the environmental action group Kalpavriksh and of Vikalp Sangam, which is the Alternatives Confluence, and the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, and serves on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. Ashish Kothari is a founding member of Kalpavriksh, which for anyone who doesn't know, is an Indian environmental action group, about 44 years old now, and involved in the coordination of Vikalp Sangam, the Alternatives Confluence, as well as the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. He's also the co-author of Churning the Earth, The Making of Global India with Asim Srivastav, and co-editor of the book Alternative Futures, India Unshackled. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Shrishtee and Ashish. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Vandana. Thanks, Dak. And also thanks to our colleagues at Global Tapestry of Alternatives and Kalpavriksh for walking along this journey with us. And what we are presenting today, just give me a moment so that I can start sharing the screen. This presentation will be shared between Ashish and me. And we have about, I guess, 30 to 40 minutes. And what we intend to, I hope you can see the screen. And what we intend to do over the next 30, 40 minutes is to share our own journey and our learnings from wherever we have worked, and what thoughts and reflections are emerging on this theme of earthy governance and interspecies justice, and raise some questions, some points of reflections for all of us. And and have some time to also reflect with all of you of what this means and what it demands us to think about in the times of crisis that we are living in. So, just to set the backdrop of this conversation, especially because we are living in the times of multiple intersecting crises, of one which is at a global scale, and it is at unprecedented scales as well. And the crises that we are facing today are the result of the dominant regimes who have actually created systems of oppression and systems of alienation that have resulted into multiple intersecting crises of ranging from ecological issues to socioeconomic to political to cultural and also personal. And so it is demanding us to look at one issue not from just a narrow lens of that this is an issue of ecology or this is an issue of climate. And as Vadna was saying, that it is not just about superficial transformation, but really looking deep into why we are in this mess that we are in, and that it is not just about one sort of crisis. When we are talking about ecology, it is also about the kind of capitalist systems and the economic systems we have lived in. It is also about the kind of political regimes that we are living in.
Hello.
And uh, I would request everybody to please keep yourself in mute, and hopefully the ones who are Mugda, who's taking the tech control, can also look at that. Thank you. So yeah, when we're talking about crisis, we're looking at these multiple layers and multiple inequalities that come with it. But we won't talk and dwell too much into crisis because we are well aware of that. So, what we really want to share with you is about different cosmovisions and worldviews of communities where those relationship with rest of nature, with the more than human world, comes in very strongly in their articulation and very strongly when they're resisting against the systems of oppressions and the crisis that I just mentioned. So this one comes from central India, where this indigenous elder, Gond Adivasi community member, Sumaru Kallo, when we asked him about why are they resisting against a mining project in their sacred forest, said that for us, nature is our god. So the animals, the rivers, the spirits in the forest are our gods, and we revere them, we hold them sacred. And if we don't protect this forest, it's not just that we will lose our own lives and livelihood, but where will the spirits in the forest go? Where will the birds in the forest go? So, what is indicative in this struggle against a mining project is very strong articulation of what a community is, which is not just about humans, it also includes the rest of nature. And that second is that when people are resisting and articulating their struggles for autonomy and creating systems of transformations, the more than human world in many ways play a central role in those articulations. And in many of these struggles, uh, the forest, the spirits in the forest, animals, river are become part of deliberation into why they're doing these struggles. And Kochi, we don't have much time to expand on it, but it has such powerful process of actually creating not just control over their forests through some transformative direct democracy action, but really also looking at their own internal injustices and leading to various intersecting transformations through this process. The other that I want to share is from the Trans-Himalayan landscape in India, from Ladakh, where we were having a conversation in a small village on rights of rivers. And I asked these young children what do they think the rights of river Indus are. And a one young shy girl sitting back behind said that the river has a right to sing and play. Now, who would articulate such strong and beautiful poetic articulation of what a river is, but children who are not yet subsumed into the dominant education system, but more importantly, young kids who are living along the river, who know what a river truly is, because when the river, because it's not just water flowing from one source to the other, but rather when it is able to create ripples, it has enough water in it, it has enough flow in it. When the river is singing is when the river is truly alive. So for communities, this is just one example, but for communities not just in India but across the world, rivers are not mere beings of, or not just mere how much energy and power they can produce, but so much more than that. They're alive, they're living, they're beings in themselves. And this famous example, of course, many of you would know from Odisha, of the Dongria Kond struggle against proposed mining by Vedanta in their sacred forest, where they said that our life is allied to the sacred law as prescribed by Niyam Raja, who is the king of law, the deity presiding over the hills. And the Niyam Raja disallows any unsustainable exploitation of forest and the land. And as kith and kin of Niyam Raja, we abide by the rules set by the Niyam Raja. So in many ways, communities actually organizing their lives based on the rhythms and moods of the natural world, and that in a sense governed by the laws of the natural world, in this case making sense of it through the deity of the mountain. But in many other landscape it changes, living by the laws of the ocean or living by the laws of the rivers or laws of the snow. The other powerful example that I want to share is from the Northeast India, where Minkit Lepcha, storyteller, powerful storyteller from the Lepcha community, shared with us that when you dam the rivers, and they have been fighting for a long time and exposing the problems of large-scale hydropower projects, says that the river Tista origin stories, or their this Tista's origin story and their stories of origins at Lepcha is very strongly tied together. So when you dam the river, you also dam their stories, you also dam their origin. So there's this sense of shared existence, shared origin, and shared emergence that is very much rooted in people's lives and ways of being. In modern context, and in many of these emerging contexts that we are seeing over the last through 2-3 decades, because of the kind of uh, transformations happening and the kind of ecological crisis we are facing, that there are new ways that people are imagining of bringing the voice of the more than human world in the Western legal systems. So, one such example is from India itself, where in 2017, the Uttarakhand High Court um, gave a judgment recognizing the rights of river Ganga and Yamuna as that of living beings. The order was stayed by the Supreme Court when the Uttarakhand state government approached the Supreme Court. But it was the very first time in the ecological jurisprudence of India where the rivers, their glaciers, forest catchment areas were recognized as living, scientifically and biologically living. Or the very powerful example from the Wanganui River ecosystem in New Zealand, where the whole ecosystem was recognized as a living being. Importantly, going to the recognition of indigenous Maori Iwi people's cosmologies of that we are the river and the river is us. So, questioning this Western notion of separation from nature at the very center, and really bringing those kinds of cosmologies in modern systems. And we see that in lots of non-indigenous people, the local communities, in modern global north discourses, this movement emerging on rights of nature, where in the US itself, lots of ordinances of Tamakwa Borough, which was talking not just about the health of the people living there, but also the ecosystems. And so really going beyond thinking from an anthropocentric point of view to bringing in the voice of nature, bringing giving seat to nature in the board meetings or table. A very recent one where Los Cedros Forest was recognized as an ecosystem with moral authorship of work of art. And there are so many interesting processes happening all across Europe, where even in at the heart of capitalist societies, there are attempts to bring the voice of nature back. And there are so many approaches where these things are being attempted. Some we shared from Indian context on indigenous and relational approaches, but there's also thinking about governance from an earth-centered perspective, or constitutional approaches, or judicial approaches as well, wherein those attempts of reimagining our institutions, bureaucracy, and everyday life from a more than human perspectives are being attempted. But most importantly, what we want to highlight is that when we're talking about rights of nature or any such modern discourses, they are still very much limited because of the context that they are set in or the languages that they're using. So, when we are really talking about bringing in the voice of the more than human or really talking about earthy governance, we have to talk about much broader things of intersections. And so, cosmovisions that affirm life, of what people in Ecuador or the Latin American context have been talking about Buen Vivir, a more broader, holistic sense of what it is to live well or what is well being for us. And that brings us to more interconnections and intersections of issues. So it's not just giving voice to nature in a board meeting, but it is much more than that, because then we begin to question what kind of livelihoods we have, we begin to question what kind of governance models we have, and we begin to transform those as well, and the internal inequities in which we live. And so, both these examples from the Sapara nation, where their process of bringing in the voice of the more than human world is very closely tied to the idea of self determination, to the idea of autonomy, to asserting that when we're talking about dream and spirit world, it is about fighting the unbridled exploitation of our resources. It is talking about the exploring of alternatives. It is talking about reviving and bringing back our culture, languages, and the immense knowledge and worldviews that are part of that. And in that process, also helping outsiders heal. And processes like territories of life, which Ashish can talk better maybe later, where communities have for long been articulating that it's not about just landscapes that we are protecting, managing, and controlling, but they are actually territories of life, because it's about respecting nature, living with the rhythms and the moods of the natural world. But it is also then becomes intersecting about livelihoods, sovereignty, democratic governance, and bringing back that cultural knowledge and respect. And ICCA consortium is one of those spaces that is actually bringing many of these communities who are articulating territories of life and custodianship of these community of these landscapes, not as owners but rather as custodians and caretakers of those territories. Um, and that exploration actually led us to places like Ladakh and Spiti, and in Northeast India as well, where we tried to understand that many of these governance systems, traditional systems of governance, we learned were very much alive. And to us, the question was that if the Indian state is offering decentralized systems of governance like the panchayats and the others, then why do people still have these traditional systems of governance? Why do they still have so much relevance and practice? And through our work in Ladakh and Spiti, especially, we've found that it is because these systems are responding to the changes and transformations um, uh, in the land, in the rivers, of the mountains. And so they're not disassociated from what and where people are living. So these systems are about when do we cultivate, when do we harvest, how do we respond to the changes in snowfall, how do we respond to the water scarcity. So they're really place based systems of governance. And through that is tied that wherever we are, we know the best the territories we live in, because we are paying attention to them, we are aware of them, and hence we are the decision makers of those territories. And that's why the whole process of autonomy and self governance becomes a very important part of this articulation. And we see that there are elements also of taking control, not over some particular people in the community, but rather the village assembly itself has a control over what happens in that territories. And of course, this is not to say that everything is perfect in these systems. There are issues of internal injustices and inequalities, but it is this openness to be able to transform those. And that's why, at least in our articulation, we are very squarely targeting that it has to have the intersections and cross sectoriality and these inequalities highlighted as much as we can. But what importantly we want to make as a point is that these lifescapes are part of a cosmic order. For example, in Spiti, where the decision making also evokes the spirits of the landscape, and these spirits guide also on the ecological transformations. Where Kanomo Peak, which is in the which is in Spiti near Kibber village, um, the spirit of the area said that you need to stop this unbridled exploitation by tourism. And for many years, they have actually stopped any trekking on Kanomo Peak and trying to protect it. So, in many ways, what these examples and these governance systems have is that it's not for just humans to decide what is happening in the landscape. The more than humans become a very important part in the decision making, and it is in reciprocity and relational dynamics that the decision making happens. And just to wrap this up part, and then I'll hand it over to Ashish, is what point we are trying to make is, when we're talking about earthy governance, it is the struggle of autonomy, it is the struggle of transformations in all the sectors, in all the spheres of life. And that's what we see from several examples that are emerging, where resistance is along with transformations, and that resistance and transformation is correlated with different spheres of life. So, Ashish, now over to you, and let me know whenever you want me to move the slides. Are you ready?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Shrishtee. So yeah, just building on the ground that Shrishtee has laid. What I'd like to do in the next 10 minutes or so is to see what are the kinds of frameworks of transformation that are emerging from these and many, many other examples. We have been, along with many collaborating groups across the world, been documenting or learning about some incredible initiatives of local resistance against extractivism, capitalism, patriarchy, state domination, and so on, but also the creation of constructive alternatives, some of them from ancient times, some very new ones, which are helping to meet people's needs and aspirations without trashing the earth and without creating the kinds of inequalities and deprivations that we see around the world. Next, yeah. So in terms of the frameworks, go ahead, Srishti. In terms of the sort of frameworks that are emerging from these sorts of examples, just keep going. One of the things that we've been using in India, but now also in other parts of the world, is what we call the flower of transformation. So what we're seeing, if you think of examples of the kind that Shrishti has given and many more, is changes or transformations, fundamental transformations taking place in, let's say, 5 spheres of life. This is kind of one somewhat artificial way of looking at it, but especially also the intersections amongst these 5s. Now, if you think of, for instance, the articulations of the indigenous of people like the Sapara or the Korchi, Mahagram Sabha, and others, what they're arguing in the political sphere, Srishti, you can go to the next one, is that democracy is not so much about voting one party into power, and then if that party is not doing what we want, then voting another party into power. 2024 was a super election year with about 50% of the world's population going for polls. But we know what happens regardless of the kind of party or government that gets elected. There's a centralization of power. The economy remains more or less extractivist, with a few differences. Some of the leftist governments might have more welfare compared to the right ones, but fundamentally, it's not changed very much. Whereas what these initiatives are arguing is that democracy is about us claiming power where we are. We are the decision makers for our territories, and insofar as there might be governments or nation states we are a part of, we will make the government accountable to our needs and aspirations and not have a whole centralized power. This also leads to another very interesting thing, which is to question the boundaries of nation states and other political boundaries. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The second crucial sphere of transformation is the economy. If you again look at many of these examples and others, what people are arguing is that whether it is land or its biodiversity or its forests or its water or its machinery or its tools, if we are the producers, we need to be in collective control of the means of production, which also then means, of course, fundamental transformations in trade, in consumption, and in many other aspects of what we think of as the economy, and in particular also going beyond thinking of the economy only from a monetary or financial perspective, but thinking of it really as the production and reproduction of dignified living in all its ways, including, of course, other species. The third sphere of transformation is social justice. This is very important because we can be doing number one and two, which is radical democracy and radical economic democracy, but we can still sustain or maybe even make worse either traditional or new inequalities. In the Indian context, for instance, casteism or gender in across the world, and in other contexts, it could be racism, many different forms of inequality and injustice that we see. And unless those are also being tackled simultaneously, and in fact, this is also a question that arises for some of the traditional governance systems that Shrishtee has provided. In our studies, we find that while they have incredible relevance even now, especially in terms of the governance and the management of the commons, there are gender inequalities, there are caste inequalities, and others. So internal reforms within the governance systems are also absolutely important, even as people struggle against the domination of capitalist corporations and governments. The fourth sphere of transformation is culture and knowledge. All of these examples actually build on their own systems of knowledge and their own cultural practices, which are unique, but also incorporating ideas, knowledge systems, cultural aspects from others. So a healthy internal and external relationship, but not discarding everything that's, for instance, there in tradition simply because modern science and technology has come, or English has come as a language or as a dominating language, so discarding one's own language, but kind of asserting that, being proud of that, but also making the changes that are necessary in what could be called hybrid knowledges and hybrid cultures. And the last, obviously the most important for us in this webinar, sphere of transformation is that of our relationship with the rest of nature. All the examples Shrishtee is given are where communities are sustaining what you see in the middle of this slide, which is a circle of life, rather than thinking of life and biodiversity and nature as a pyramid in which human beings are on top. And please note that in this figure, it's the man on top, even the woman is below. And rather that we think of ourselves as a circle of life. Now, for those of us who are living in cities or in sort of modern, highly rationalist ways of living, this is a huge challenge. How do we reintegrate ourselves within nature? Is something that, and then also think of not just human spirit, but also the spirits of the rest of nature and issues of rights and so on. Next. And I think a very, very crucial part of this is also transformations in the education system. Across the world, I mean, we certainly see this in India, education systems are alienating us from the rest of nature and our own cultural roots. And in some sense also from each other, because they're so highly individualistic. So they create illusions of being able to survive alone, individualistic. The selfie is the most popular photograph these days. Whereas these examples of alternative learning spaces are trying to actually recreate the links with the rest of nature, with cultural roots, not just our own, but also others. Learning as fun, learning as creative, and a lot more aspects of what, for instance, Gandhiji called learning not just in the head, but also with the hands and the heart. And we've added feet and soul there. Next. So if we think of earthy governance and interspecies justice from the point of view of this flower of transformation, basically what we're saying is that if you look at each of these spheres, radical democracy, is politics such that it actually is giving a voice to to the more than human or the non-human or to other species, right? Is the economy such that it's within the ecological limits of the planet or of the region that we're living in, and is an economy of caring and sharing with each other as human beings, but also with other species? Is social justice being actually bringing in elements of equality and justice for all human beings, but again also thinking of other species as being equal in some sense, right? Is knowledge and culture building on our relationship with nature? Are these spiritual connections with the rest of nature surviving or sustaining or being created anew? And all of this leading, of course, to the sustaining of the planet itself. Next slide. One of the very important, relatively new sort of dimensions of this is what's being called bioregionalism or biocultural regionalism, where one begins to question political boundaries, especially nation state boundaries in areas that have been colonized in the past. If you look at South Asia, for instance, 6 or 7 or 8 countries which have been created for historical reasons, including colonialism, but which have cut rivers into 3 different nation states, which have cut mountain ranges, which have blocked cultural exchanges, blocked nomadic peoples and nomadic wildlife populations from going back and forth. So can we begin to reimagine, next slide, Shrishtee, can we begin to sort of reimagine our political planning and economic planning from a biocultural regional approach? So if you think of South Asia as, instead of being divided into these nation states, right now, for instance, there's going to be a huge conflict looming as China is building a dam just north of Arunachal Pradesh in India, which is going to block India's biggest, one of the biggest rivers in India coming into Northeast and feeding tens of millions of people. We've already done that to Bangladesh in India by creating the Farakka barrage. We're now thinking of making dams on the Indus, which will have problems for Pakistan. So instead of that kind of thing, can we actually begin to think of river basins, mountain ranges, lake ecosystems, adjacent forests as being bioregions and cultural regions that can be planned and governed in very, very different ways? Next. So I think basically what this also raises is this whole question of the agency of nature. I think most of us who work on this in this realm believe that the rest of nature has its own agency. What I think could be questions is, how is that expressed? So, for instance, we have one of the ex-Gobas or headmen up in Ladakh. When we asked him why does he think this climate crisis is coming? And he said, look, we've disturbed the spirits of the land. We have bulldozers all over the landscape now of mountains, of snow. If the spirits of nature are not happy, how can we humans be? And why would nature then not retaliate? Is retaliation, climate crisis, elephants going on a rampage, dams being burst, such as in Northeast India and Teesta recently. But also, despite everything we're doing to the rest of nature, how nature continues to provide to us. Can all of this actually be considered, in some sense, nature expressing its own agency? But then even a more fundamental question, do we need to assign an intention to nature in order to actually recreate or create or sustain relationships and ethics of mutual respect and interdependence? I'm just leaving this question for everybody to think of without necessarily giving an answer. Next. I think, Shrishtee, now it's back to you, and we end in a couple of minutes.
Yes. Thanks, Ashish. So, just building on what Ashish was saying, for all of us who are trapped in or seduced by this atomized modernity in our urban cocoons, the crucial element is, how do we integrate our lives, those elements of reverence, respect, reciprocity, interdependence with the rest of nature that many traditional systems that we mentioned earlier are talking about and embody. And how do we rekindle the balance between human needs, aspirations, and the rights of the other species and beings to thrive? And for us, when we're talking about earthy governance, it is about systemic transformations, and also transformations in consciousness, in our ways of being, in our values, in our actions, and how do we live our everyday life, and where society's moral consideration is not just for human communities, and many a times it is also not for all of human communities, but it also extends to the more than human world, to the entire earth. And for us, I feel what has been really inspirational is learning from the communities at the grassroots. And one example that I share here of responsibility that senior Adivasi elder from Kochi, where we started this conversation from, shared with us that to really achieve well-being, everyone needs to know what their responsibility is. So it's actually looking at rights framework also from a very different perspective, from a responsibility perspective, which is that what is my responsibility, what is my sense of being in this world which is undergoing through the crisis, and how do I be present in this world? So in a sense, also what Gandhi spoke about, that let's talk about responsibilities first and then what our rights would be. So in that sense, when we're talking about earthy governance, it is about finding our own responsibilities, but it is also about nurturing interbeingness, what Thich Nhat Hanh spoke about, where it's realizing the interrelatedness and interdependence of our lives with the rest of nature, finding that kinship that Dongria Cones talk about, of being in relationship, or being cousins and kith and kin of the mountains and the rivers. It's building that everyday awareness and paying attention to what's unfolding around us. And it's not just attention wherein we are living in attention deficit societies, but really paying that radical attention to the birds around us, to when dragonflies come, to when the flamingos come. So it's really finding that sense of intuitive intelligence, which a lot of communities, indigenous peoples across the world talk about, that it is not just about rationalizing, but really finding that sense of intuitive way of being. And in many ways, it also calls for standing in radical solidarity with so many movements of struggles for against extractive development and against systems of oppression and repression that we see all around us. So it's actually standing with the communities also who are struggling at the grassroots. So this is our last slide where we evoke the new horizons for a life-centric world where all of us are able to find a sense of place and rootedness and radical attention to wherever we are, where there's a sense of entangled empathy and responsibility, where we are able to resist the colonized minds of ourselves and what it has done and damage that it has done to all of us. And for many of us, it is the storytelling that becomes a very, very important part of decolonizing, because really at the heart of it is the crisis of the story that is being told to us. The dominant story is about scarcity, it's about competition, it is about hierarchy, it is about this politics of fear, it is this politics of competition, and trying to become as productive as we can, and this continued expansion. So how can we tell different stories? How can we tell the stories of Korchi? How can we tell the stories of Lepchas? How can we tell these stories where these values of empathy, rootedness, attention, being part of a larger community and just one element of this whole world is not just spoken about but truly embodied. So what Ashish and others have spoken about also, in sense of bringing this pluriversal thinking and diversity of ways of knowing and being, and how more of these stories can be shared, how we can embed and create more such, is possibly a new horizon for a life-centric world. Okay, the network that has helped co-organize with TAG, just to give a brief introduction to Global Tapestry of Alternatives, is that in many ways we are trying to bring such stories together, create a space where people who are resisting and trying to nurture these worldviews, where this reverence of nature is part of everyday life, and questioning the dominant strand of Western thinking, really bringing many of these together, because in their own they feel they need that sense of collective solidarity and nurturance, and possibly creating a space for also collective envisioning of a just world or many worlds, and how do we get there, and really bringing earthy governance as part of a radical democracy and transformation process, wherein when we're talking about changing our relationship with the more than human world, it is also talking about more radical forms of transformations, radical forms of democracy, autonomy, and struggle for self-governance as well. So, thank you very much. I hope you found something of resonance and enjoyed this conversation. And we're looking forward to hearing your own thoughts and hearing your own reflections of some of the provocations that we shared with you. And if you would like to be in touch with us, these are our email IDs. So, I hand it back to Vandana.
Thank you so much, Shrishtee and Ashish, for that incredibly enlightening presentation, and so very important in the context of what we are facing today, the multiple crises that are unfolding as we speak. So let me see whether we have any questions. I know we have a lot of comments and really interesting, shared like links about similar efforts around the world. And that's really wonderful. I see that there are some questions here as well. So let me just quickly go to the top. And I can also ask people if you would rather unmute and ask your question directly, then please do that. Otherwise, I can read out the questions as they come in. So we have, let's see. I saw at least one. Okay, here we go from Sebastian. Sebastian, do you want to speak aloud? Or if not, okay, so this is what Sebastian says. How do you think state disaster risk management policies could foster autonomous processes around community living and enhance the governance and management of the commons?
Vandana, Ashita Devar has also a question. She has mentioned that.
Is that before Sebastian's?
Or we can club few questions together.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to Ashita's in a moment then. Why don't we start with Sebastian since I've just read it out? So this is in the context of state disaster risk management. We know that one of the impacts of climate change is increased extreme weather. So this has already become a very common thing. Look at what's happening with wildfires in California, for example. So how would autonomous processes be fostered around disasters and disaster management? Any thoughts on that, Ashish or Shrishtee, or both of you?
Shrishtee, go ahead. I'll add.
No, go ahead, Ashish. You unmuted yourself, so I guess you have an immediate response.
I know. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, firstly, it's very important for us to recognize that disaster management strategies in many parts of the world, certainly what we know of from India, do not really give agency to local communities. It's like, okay, the relevant state agencies will deal with it. And of course, we know that they don't have the capacity or not necessarily even the interest to actually deal with it. So it really goes to the fundamentals of who is in control for what, right? So for instance, a lot of disasters, of course, are generated globally. I mean, climate crisis, for instance, is not localized in its generation, but local activities can make things much worse. So if you are to, for instance, the dam burst that happened on the Teesta River, some time back, was despite all the warnings that local communities had been giving, saying that you should not actually be damming the Teesta River. The same thing is happening across the Himalaya, right? Now, if there was more direct democracy, our first sphere of transformation, perhaps some of these voices would be heard. And you would be able to avoid certain kinds of disasters or the exacerbation of disasters which are generated globally but happen locally because of such actions. Now, I should also add here that doesn't necessarily mean that local communities have all the answers. If climate crisis is being generated because of fossil fuel burning, etc., by the rich across the world, it's not necessarily something local communities know how to deal with. They have some answers, they have certain agency over it, but they need also support in terms of information, in terms of techniques or practices that could be used. For instance, to deal with, say, the water crises that is created when glaciers are receding. It's again happening across the Himalaya. And here is where we find that if you really have a sensitive government agency or a sensitive civil society organization which works with the local community, building on their own knowledge, but adding additional knowledge to it, you would be able to create certain practices of adaptation and resilience that would otherwise not take place. So disaster management actually needs to also become disaster governance, which means decision making needs to be decentralized as also bioregional. We actually, through something called the bioregionalism working group in South Asia, there has been a hazard mapping of the Teesta River to look at what are the possibilities of disasters that arise because of so-called natural, but more because of human activity. and what needs to be done to make the whole river basin much more resilient. So we need to think at that very local, but also at that larger bioregional scale, which means the kind of governance mechanisms that we've been talking about. I hope that has some elements of an answer.
Shrishtee, did you want to add something? Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Ashish. And in fact, I have a question related to that, but I'll ask that later. So let me ask Ashita if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Thanks, Vandana, and thanks, Srishti and Ashish, for such a wonderful, thought-provoking presentation, especially towards the end, how we tell our stories. That's, I think, the most important takeaway for me. Uh, my question, though, is more related to what Ashish was saying about democracy. So, in the context of democracy, and of course, I'm assuming that most of us already agree with the fact that the democracy is not the way we look at it. It's not majority voting, which is democracy. It is way deeper, actually, what really democracy is or should be. And I look at current Delhi's election happening, and air pollution, solid waste management, Yamuna River, all these becoming issues now. And I wonder that why today the issues are there in the election agenda, because the middle class or the upper middle class is being hit by these things directly. Uh, but what is the way we can push for climate sustainability agenda in these like so-called electoral processes, which we are constrained by the way they are currently? We can only hope and wait and change. And yeah, that. So how do we push for those before these things start actually hitting? I mean, it's just me thinking out loud and also posing it as a question out there. So yeah.
Your turn.
Thanks, Ashita, for your question. I mean, I have two parts to the question that you just asked. One is that it is indeed the crisis that we are in currently in India about democracy and the electoral politics is actually a much longer struggle, because now we're even fighting for the things that for long movements kind of came up with. For example, the Forest Rights Act, or all these progressive laws and policies that are being further diluted, and they are being misused or amended in ways that actually hinder the rights of peoples and communities, and actually the fight against this kind of exploitation of nature. So right now we are in the whole circle back again, where we need to protect these laws and policies. Whatever little things that we had to make do with protection are also being used and misused. So in that sense, the struggle is even more. The second, because of the first one, through our own engagements with people's movement and working on these issues, it is to me it is becoming even more evident that change will not happen because certain political parties convinced. It could happen, but it's not going to be the central space where this change will happen. Change will only happen when people are mobilized, when people are taking up these issues, and that's where the middle class has to people like you and I will have to do a lot more in taking up these issues than before, because we have to push, we have to get out on the roads, we have to really bring this to the table, because until unless that happens, political parties will just go with business as usual. And even And it's not about which sectors or ideologies they belong in, because in that sense, almost all are convinced that the kind of destructive development that we have is the way forward. So we really need to bring back this question and dialogue as civic space, and how we are organizing in the civic space, and really um, get out on the streets and bring these issues as the more issues of our life and survival than anything else. But that's not happening enough, and I guess that's where more organizing is needed, because people's power is something that they cannot crush, as we saw in the farmers protest, and usually when we see people coming together are difficult to crush. So how we can organize ourselves in that way in these times is, I personally feel, much more important than pushing just political parties. Yeah, maybe Ashish, you want to add your insights to this?
No, just a quick 1 minute, which is that I think, I mean, totally agree with what Shrishtee just said, but also I think that this thing of coming together, we need to figure out how we can actually transcend our own internal boundaries, whether they're boundaries of classes or castes or gender or territories that sometimes we NGOs tend to make for ourselves, and then we don't work necessarily with others, ego boundaries. There's so much. If you remember, go back to the slide we showed of the pyramid of life, which was ego, and then the circle of life, which was eco. So yeah, it's challenging, but I think we have to do that. And we see across the world that where people do transcend these boundaries, they're able to achieve some incredible results on the ground, with parties, with governments, but especially on the ground. So yeah, that's just an additional point.
Thank you. I just want to quickly look at, because I'm trying to keep track of who raised hands first. It's not very easy because I can't see everyone. So if you've raised your hand and it seems like I haven't seen you, please put a note in the chat. Right now, I think we have, in the following order, we have Basham, Ecoist, and then Stephen, and then Nagraj. So Ecoist, if you'd like to start.
Namaste, everyone. I'm from Indus Valley, from the Sindhu Darya, and we've been connected from a long time, Ashish and Shrishtee. So it's very nice to see what a big progress you're doing there, and it feel a bit like sad, like we have nothing like that happening. So my question is that since I don't believe in that boundaries made by the colonials, this is one of the biggest tragedy of mankind, not for South Asians, but for the mankind, which especially the boundary between India and Pakistan. So my question is that to both of you, that how can we make something together? Like this bioregion where I live is not really disconnected from yours. We are still one. Five of India's rivers flow where I live. In Punjab. So how can we make something like a common body or something like that? Because we need the guidelines and the strategies from you. To be frank. So this is what I need to know. How much are the possibilities? Thank you.
Okay, so this time let me just go first. Thanks, Basham. Yes, we have been in touch. It's been very nice to be in touch with you. There have been attempts at trying to create people's forums between Pakistan and India, which have achieved a little bit. Given the political circumstances, they can only actually achieve a little bit at the moment. But I think what's been missing in those discussions, and we need to start that, maybe through the South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group, is to look at the bioregional, biocultural regional aspects. And Indus could be a fantastic way to kind of generate this. So I would say let's start with a dialogue. Some people from your part of South Asia, some people from our part of South Asia, maybe some people from Nepal and maybe Tibet, to look at actually this whole bioregion, at least start conceiving what could it look like were it not for these nation-state political boundaries. I'd suggest that let's start with the dialogue and then see where it goes from there. I also just want to quickly add that I think because our examples were all mostly terrestrial, that this is also something we need to do in terms of the oceans. So, well, I mean, Pakistan, India, of course, also shares
Yeah.
the Bay of sorry, the Indian Ocean, that part of it.
Yeah.
We have if you're talking about South Asia, of course, connections with Sri Lanka, with other Southeast Asia, and so on. And one of our colleagues in the South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group, I think he's here actually, John is here, right? So they did an amazing report on looking at the oceans and the coasts from a bioregional perspective. Just quickly on a earthy governance thing, this example that comes to mind, which we forgot to put in, is from a community, a coastal community in South Africa that's been fighting against mining, smart cities, expressways, and oil and gas explorations by Shell in the oceans. And one of their arguments is that the oceans are where our spirits go after our ancestors, our people die. The spirits go to the oceans.
Yeah.
They live there with the spirits of other creatures of the oceans. So why should we allow oil and gas exploration in the oceans? It's as much part of our life as anything else, right? So I think we need to bring also the marine angles into this, which unfortunately in our presentation also we've kind of neglected a bit. But yeah, so Basham, let's start with this dialogue.
Yeah. Thank you, Ashish.
Thank you. Thank you to you both. We have Stephen next. Stephen, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm a university professor in the US, and I work with an organization called the Alternatives Project. Thank you both for a brilliant talk and for the work that you continue to do. I've got a big question with no easy answer, obviously. Capitalism is clearly not the whole problem, but it is a major problem. And you've been thinking about this a lot. You've been talking to people a lot. How do you think we can get rid of capitalism? We meaning the world. And how do you think that can happen? What have been your thoughts about that? Thank you.
Sorry, Shrishtee, it's your turn.
Well, Stevens, as you already said, that it's a big question and no easy answer. My only response is that capitalism or any of the crises that we were talking about is being challenged, responded every day, every moment by communities who, for example, do ecological organic farming and sow their seeds, which are not corporate seeds, but the seeds that their ancestors and they have saved and conserved in their seed banks, or wherever people like you who have joined today because you're disturbed by what's happening in the world, or wherever people are resisting and raising their voice against this oppression. So it's happening every day. It's happening maybe in small ways, but let's not, at least I wouldn't eliminate the power of small, or the power of one day or one moment. And in that sense, our work on alternatives is so important, because it is about highlighting these many stories, these many communities who, through their everyday living and dwelling, by not being maybe diminished by the extractive capitalist systems, are continuing to do what they believe should be a life of well-being and nurturance, and in that sense, good life. And they're living that and doing that and embodying that. I think that is where capitalism is challenged every day. It's sometimes not so visible, it's sometimes not so clear, but it is still happening as everyday acts of resistance and everyday acts of transformation. So that's where I think capitalism is being challenged. The scales of it and everything, I feel that it is too difficult to answer right now, but maybe Ashish can share some insights on that.
Well, I mean, two things quickly. One is that I think we have to get better at connecting these grounded resistances and alternatives across the world, right? And the global tapestry of alternatives is just one humble attempt at that. We need many more. And Stephen, of course, you're also part of some of these attempts. So we have to get better at that. And this is where the sort of challenge of cutting across each other's boundaries also, seeing a common cause in the different struggles, whether it's anti-caste struggles or anti-racism struggles, or it's anti-extractivism struggles or struggles for alternatives, etc. So that's one crucial thing. The second thing is I think we also need to get better at exposing the so-called solutions that the capitalist and statist system is giving us, because a lot of people are getting taken in by them. Climate solution, anything, climate smart agriculture, climate smart this, climate whatever. The word smart gets added and automatically it's supposed to be a solution, right? How do we understand these as being also processes by which capitalism is trying to reinvent itself and pose itself as being the system that will solve all the crises. The crisis it itself has created, but it will solve, right? And so it's getting more and more clever at that. It as in the corporations and so on are getting cleverer at that. So we have to be able to figure out ways by which we can expose that so that even that can be fought. And if we say, for instance, renewable energy in India is now big business. Is that really the solution to the climate crisis, or is it something else? Is it also energy demand management? Is it about challenging luxury energy consumption? Is it also about decentralized renewable energy in the hands of communities, energy sovereignty? Unless we also do that, only the conventional exposes of capitalism are not going to help anymore. So I think these two things I wanted to add to what Shrishtee said.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We are going to go to Nagraj next, and then John had put a note that he wanted to share a frustration. So John could go after that, and then Halvest Karim. Okay, so Nagraj, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Vandana, and thank you both Shrishtee and Ashish for really enriching presentations. I got a couple of thoughts and also I mean, this was a conversation, but uh, in a sense, your presentations in terms of whether it's the ecological crisis, damage to species, or in fact the climate crisis, kind of connects very much to a larger economy that seeks to kind of grow without end. And there have been a lot of conversations recently around that inherent drive of a capitalist economy, and it raises questions of growth and degrowth and so on. So there's also two aspects here. One is linking to the point, Ashish, that you were just saying in terms of also reducing demand and around questions of inequality. So one question is that how could one think of reducing wasteful consumption by particularly by the very well off, in a sense, to therefore reduce demand and reduce ecological damage, but also around questions of growth. What would be more appropriate way of thinking through questions of growth for one for the Indian economy, and secondly possibly for other more developed economies? The only real life example we have is of Japan, which for the last 40 years, not because they intended, but it's been effectively zero rate of growth since the 1980s. But it's been at a very high level of GDP and prosperity and so on. For India, would we then think of, because issues of degrowth have been coming? I'm sorry, I'm more sharing my thoughts and then I would love to hear yours. For India, would one then argue for a more equitable but much lower rate of growth, but not necessarily zero, not necessarily degrowth, but say a much lower rate of growth, which because we need to generate employment, need to generate livelihoods. So think of it sort of differentially depending on the societies that we are different societies are, while also restricting sort of elite wasteful consumption. I don't know whether I'm sort of sounding very coherent, but I hope I'm making some things coming across, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about how we can think of this question of growth and a lower and more equitable rate of growth in our Indian social context.
Whose turn is it? Mine or Shrishtee, yours? Me. Okay. Thanks, Naga. You folks are asking very difficult questions, which we definitely do not have answers to, or all the answers to, and they're all worthy of several hours or several days more discussion. So this is going to be necessarily simplistic, of course. But Naga, since you know us, you know we're not trying to avoid the question. So what could be an alternative to conventional models of growth-led development, right? Say for a country like India. To me, there are two aspects here which are very important. One is to do economic planning, instead of pitching it as, okay, how can we achieve X percentage growth and what is needed in the economy to achieve 6%, 8%, 10% economic growth rate. If we say, okay, what do we need to do to, let's say, eradicate hunger? Okay. And we look at examples like the 5,000 Dalit women farmers of Deccan Development Society who've managed to do it on their own with no government support and so on, and no corporate seeds, or a number of other such examples, maybe even some state government examples where they've done some fantastic stuff like this. And we say, okay, if those are the approaches that are needed, how much money is needed? By whom? From where? And we might realize that actually you're able to generate that kind of resource without first saying, okay, let's do this much economic growth and then make sure that actually there is money for NRGS or for poverty reduction or whatever it is. So it's flipping the whole argument around, which is what is happening at the grassroots in all of these alternative examples. If as a result, growth also happens, good or not. Okay. So it's just converting that. So that's one thing. Secondly, and this points to what you're saying in terms of elite consumption, redistribution. In a country like India, we could perhaps actually solve issues of hunger and so on and so forth with a much better redistribution, or issues of power deprivation, electricity deprivation, with much better redistribution. But that means challenging power and challenging inequalities and challenging those who actually take the decisions. If you were to take Delhi, I'm sure Delhi has enough power right now to meet the basic consumption needs of the entire population, but not if the rich want to have air conditioners in every house and so on. So yes, challenging elite consumption and redistribution across all the different sectors that we are talking about. And then the third thing would be managing demand itself. So this is not just about elite consumption, it's about overall management of demand. No renewable energy is ever going to be renewable, as you well know better than us, if we're not actually saying here's the limit to how much energy we can actually produce, and because that's enough actually for basic needs and aspirations, right? So I think it's a combination of these things that we would have to approach, but that's a very fundamentally different way of approaching economic planning than what we have right now. Yeah, and of course, this means challenging those who control the economy. So that's a very fundamental thing also, and which then goes hand in hand with radical democracy, looking at ecological limits. Why does the Indian economy, for instance, why does the ministry, the economics ministries or the finance ministry, why are they not housed within the Ministry of Environment? Even if one were to take governance, current political governance into account, which I don't believe in, but suppose we were, the Ministry of Environment should be the overall ministry within which there should be economy, within which there should be, because otherwise we are crossing ecological limits all the time and thinking of environment as an externality. So I think all of these things are thing. And then what are our indicators of well-being? If you were to think of everybody having access to adequate, nutritious, healthy food, everybody having access to clean air, everybody having access to clean water, everybody having access to creative sources of education, learning, decision making, etc., then GDP and percentage economic growth are nonsensical indicators anyway. So all of this, I think, has to be transformed, changed, and challenged.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashish.
Excuse me. Thank you both. So I would like to hand the mic to John. John, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot for your presentation, Ashish and Shrishtee. Actually, listening to it, I feel a huge sense of hypocrisy. That's myself. I mean, I'm in my mid-70s, and I started life as an activist. I've been a researcher, I've been a teacher, a development practitioner, and now, what shall I say, at the sunset of one's life, you see a huge sense of frustration at for us, we can intellectualize a lot of this. We can sit in our respective urban or rural settings and talk about these things. But increasingly, I feel that the answer, as you have uh, rightly said with all these examples, is it's only the ecosystem people, those who relate directly with the ecosystem, who can really make a change in what we are talking about. And it's really uh, they who matter. I mean, we can be facilitators, and often we talk of being catalysts. I think that is also the problem, because a catalyst never changes in a reaction, and that is partly the problem that we have. So, looking back uh, in my life, I think the only real meaningful part was the first 5 years that I spent living with the community, right bang in the middle of them, and not trying to study them or anything like that, but try to help out, uh, try to unlearn, try to learn from their wisdom, try to improve what is possible. And I'm beginning to feel that we need to somehow encourage more and more young people to take such choices. Uh, Otherwise, I wonder whether our just talking about it and writing books about it is going to make a difference. So, I mean, as I said, there's just a sense of frustration that I want to articulate. I don't know if others feel the same, maybe not. But I really increasingly begin to feel this. And I think unless young people uh, take up this challenge and really go to the ecosystem communities and work with them, I doubt if we can bring about any change in our system. And if I may just add one word about this discussion on growth. Uh, oh, there is so much of this talk about growth. I mean, when you talk about growth, it's just an arithmetic figure. You're comparing this at one point of time with another point of time and saying that it has increased by a certain percentage. I mean, I feel that is not the way to go about it. To talk about zero growth or degrowth or 5% growth. The moot question is the composition of that growth, the material composition of that growth. Are you building houses for the poor or flats for the rich? Both these require steel and cement and all the rest of it. Are you building public transport or private cars? I think that is the moot question, the composition of growth. It's not the figure of growth. It could be zero, it could be 10, whatever. But it really is about the composition of growth and how we can change that. And that is a longer debate. But I just wanted to react to this comment about growth and degrowth. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Vanna, if I can just say,
Sure. Yeah.
and if one looks at also just the growth bit, if one looks at the last quarter of GDP growth of India, the one sector that has contributed the most is the construction and the real estate to the growth. So it also tells us that where this whole growth is coming really from. But also, John, thanks for sharing your frustration, because within that frustration is also the wisdom of where we need to work more. And I would just want to share, because Bashim is also here, about, if he's still here, about this process that we started in Ladakh, along with Snow Leopard Conservancy India Trust, of walking along the river with young Ladakhi students. And it was this initial idea by some of us about how do we connect to the river, but not just about connecting to the river in superficial ways, but really bringing in the young people from Ladakh who have gone out and increasingly losing connection with the river. And in our last walk last year, when we did in September, one amazing thing that happened was this young girl who all that while for 7 8 days was not at all interested in what we were doing and things that we were documenting. By the end of it, broke down to see the amount of plastic that we found along the whole range, along the whole path of Indus River. And she started crying profusely because she felt so helpless that she can't do anything about it. And all of a sudden said that every time I drove along the river, I never really realized how much pain she is in, and now I finally know that it's suffering so much. So just knowing the suffering of rest of nature and more than human world can transform us and our emotions. And I don't know how much she has changed her work, but one could see how profoundly she was also impacted by it. So just resonating very strongly to what you were saying, that as young people, all of us need to go out, learn more, and once we see the pollution and the pain, possibly things change inside us, and we can get the charge to really stand up for the rivers and the ecosystems that are being destroyed. Thanks for sharing your frustration.
Thank you, Shrishtee. Thank you, John. Ashish, did you want to add anything before we go to Halwest Karim?
No, I mean, I totally go with what John is saying. I think and the more we can support, which is why, whether it's in terms of petitions or just being there on the ground in support of them, like what some of us tried to do, and Mira, if she's still here, is still doing with a number of people's movements across the country, Narmada, or wherever, or filing petitions against what is being imposed on them, with them, or helping them to actually articulate their own stories. So it's not us telling their stories, but they themselves actually writing about it, talking about it, doing their own videos, making their own movies, etc. I think the more we can, with our privileges, whatever we have, if we can be in support of and facilitation, not speaking on their behalf, but actually just enabling, the more the possibilities of transformation by ecosystem people would happen. I just want to quickly add a caveat there, which is that disprivileged communities or people within cities who may no longer, unfortunately, be able to be ecosystem people in that sense also need that kind of support. And many of them are actually trying to recreate their own settlements, like slum settlements or elsewhere, as being more dignified spaces of living, which include some elements of the rest of nature. So if we can also be kind of enabling that and helping them to exchange information with each other, exchange ideas, do cross visits and so on, you begin to see that even in urbanized spaces, which are so otherwise nature deficient, people can begin to recreate their lives through this, including the most disprivileged section. So we also need to stand in solidarity with such people. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashish. And I'd like to get back to that before we end. I don't know how much time we can take, but I do want to first invite Halwest Karim to speak your question. And thank you so much for being patient.
Thank you so much, Vandana. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Halwest from Khorasan region of Iraq. I'm ecofeminist. Also, I'm president of Azad Bun organization. Thank you so much for Shrishtee and Ashish for this brilliant presentation. It's very spiritual. Shrishtee mentioned that people should be mobilized and to push political system and government. So I do believe, but the problem is, I do believe in the power of individual and community to speak out and to be mobilized, to raise their voice and to resist again the political system. But what I'm seeing today around the world that the social movement are not strong, particularly in the such community that people are weak politically. They are not allowed to represent themselves. People are hopeless. They think that they think that they cannot make difference. And usually when I'm talking with those people, they're thinking that we lost so much from the resources, from everything that we have. And they do believe that they cannot resist the political system. I mean capitalism or neoliberalism. So I would like to hear from, maybe you are facing same issue. So I would like to ask if you have experienced such issue, how you deal with it. What's your suggestion? How we can invite more people to raise their voice at the same time, to think that they can do change. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Always.
Thank you.
Just 2 points maybe, because also we are wrapping up. One is that I think it's a difficult question to answer in any generalized manner, because the kind of crisis different communities are in is at different levels, and sometimes standing up to the state or any systems of oppression is very, very difficult and challenging circumstances. And you would know well, especially because of the kind of region you come from, it's even uh, everyday existence is so difficult difficult to live, and so resisting systems of oppressions and organizing and then transforming those systems becomes even more difficult. But bringing some things from our context is what we have learned from people and communities who have been able to challenge certain systems is organizing around people power, but also creating exchanges and collaborations among communities. Because often when we are in our own struggles, wherever we are, it feels like we are very alone. It's only us who is facing this giant massive mining company and military and oppression. But once we are able to share certain experiences across communities, then we get a sense of not being alone in our struggles and being able to support each other, not just in resisting, but also strategizing as to how we can transform those situations of oppression. How can we organize? How can we build systems of self governance? It has happened, for example, in the first example that I shared from Kochi, where there's a long history of oppression by the state, but also people's power in organizing, creating alternative learning spaces, creating their own study circles where they can learn more about what's happening in the region, to gain control over their forest, over their lands, and then mobilizing themselves, adopting different strategies. And that community actually interacting with community in Latin America and learning about, in Venezuela, for instance, and learning about how their struggles are actually quite similar to what they're doing, and exchanging knowledges and ways of doing things. So sometimes those spaces of collaboration, co-learning, and solidarity sharing become really important and help strengthen communities.
Yeah, and I think something that Shrishtee had said in her part of the presentation, telling stories. I think we need much more of storytelling of the amazing things that people are doing against the tide, right? And this can be, of course, not only through articles, but art, poetry, fiction. These are things that actually can enormously inspire people. Our moderator Vandana, for instance, writes some fantastic speculative fiction or science fiction, and I reading that, I get even further inspired to continue doing what I'm doing, right? So I think it's really about us being able to convey things or enabling communities on the ground to convey things in manners that are beyond the dry intellectual. The manner in to use forms which reach people's hearts. Now that's what the capitalist system is really good at. That's what religious bigots are very good at. But we haven't actually been so good at it. We need to get much better at getting to people's hearts, emotions. We tend to think of, oh my God, no, we can't be emotional. We have to be scientific and blah, blah, blah. But unless we actually use the full human faculties we have and the faculties of the rest of nature, enabling nature's art also to come out in what we're expressing, I don't think we're going to be able to inspire people. And today's generation, newer generations are extremely, I mean, there's climate anxiety, there's this, there's that, etc. So we have to use these creative, enjoyable forms also to get across to people, tell stories. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, although I also have a few questions, and I'm sure others do as well, it is getting close to wrap up time. I would like us to think maybe in last maybe 2 minutes, if you all could summarize something that we could walk away from, because one of the things we don't want is we don't want this to be just a one-off webinar and then we go back to our usual lives, right? Of course, a lot of us are doing in our own spheres a lot of important work, but can you just leave us with some closing words that have to do with the basics, the central thing of what you said about renegotiating our relationship with the rest of nature? And we'll stop there. So please, a minute each, perhaps.
Take word.
Ashish, you go ahead. I think I started, so you have to.
Okay, Vandana, I think maybe just if I can recount a very small incident. So when COVID hit and we were all locked up in our houses in different parts of the world, I think one thing that kind of continued to inspire me was the tree outside my window. It's a laburnum or amalthus as we call it, and it started flowering brilliant golden petals, no? And it was talking to me. Um, I opened up at that point in time for it to talk to me. And I think if we can just be listening to, even in the most urban environments, there are elements of the rest of nature which could be talking to us and we could be talking to them. How do we open ourselves up to that? That I think is probably for me a central essence of this.
Thank you. Shrishtee.
Yeah, thanks, Vanna, for that provocative question. And for me, it is including what Ashish was saying, but also it's being able to notice the spider in my room, and when it looks at me, sometimes when I'm also looking at it, of what my sense of responsibility is, and what is my relationship with this spider, what is my relationship with this tree right outside my room, and what are the birds that are coming on this tree, and what is my relationship and sense of responsibility. For me, that is really important, and how that sense of responsibility is then transformed into an action, an everyday action. So yeah, I remind myself every day that.
Thank you. And that reminds me that the wild birds that have tamed me in my back garden are waiting for their sunflower seeds, talking of responsibility. So thank you, everybody, and especially Ashish and Shrishtee for opening the horizons for us. And also to our collaborators, GTA and Kalpavriksh, and everyone who takes this work to heart and goes out into the world and dreams of and works for a better world than we have today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vanna.
Thanks, Vandana. Thanks, TACC, GTA, everybody else, colleagues in Kalpavriksh.